So we'll start with our prayer together today. Glory be to the Father, all power and love.
Created me.
Glory
be to the Son,
Who
who
in
is his incarnation,
became man. With the other
that I become
Glory be to the Holy Spirit who divinizes me in the Son and makes me a partaker of divine nature. Glory be to the Holy and undivided Trinity, now and forever. Amen.
Rosemary, you got some yawning going on there.
Sorry, you weren't supposed to see that. I didn't block it out. I can't hear you. You keep coming in and out. I don't know if you're near enough to the mic.
And is that happening for others as well? Coming, kind of going in and out. Oh, I don't know if it's because I maybe. How is that? Any better?
A little bit.
A little bit. Yeah.
Oops. Well, we'll just live with what we got, huh?
Yes. No, I set my alarm. I don't want to miss this.
Well, I don't either. That's a great thing. I was thinking we might have a few more people on the Zoom today because as I mentioned last week in the gathering, I went right from here last week over to the Sarah Club where they had about 65 people there for the lunch. They want me to tell a vocation story because going to put everyone on mute here for a second. And then if you want to unmute yourself to talk, just by all means do so. So I went from our gathering last Wednesday over to the Sarah Club and I was supposed to speak for 25 minutes and we did about an hour and 15 minutes and nobody moved. So I presume it was a good thing. Maybe they didn't have anything else to do, but who knows? Anyway, it was, I felt there was a good synergy and a number of people asked after the meeting, how can we access the Wednesday gathering? So I gave them the information. I expected to see a few people perhaps on the call and maybe down the road we will. I don't see anyone on the call today that I've not seen before. And be that as it may, one thing I was going to tell the newcomers, but I think it applies to the old comers as well. You know, the vision of Christianity that I'm trying to share with us and introduce us to, because I know it's foreign to most of the people I've encountered in my ministry. I realize it takes a while to acclimate your vision to what I'm trying to promote, a vision of Trinitarian deification and contemplative prayer. So that's not the operating system that most of us operate from. It's not the lens through which we view the Gospels or our lives or the world. So it takes a long time, takes a while to reacclimate your way of thinking, your way of praying, and your way of approaching God to what I'm presenting to you that was presented to me as a gift from the early church and from the Eastern Christian church. So all of you have heard that before at one time or another, but hopefully down the road we'll have people joining who have never heard this before. So I'm going to repeat that it takes several gatherings or maybe a couple of years of gatherings before the vision actually starts to become real, and one screen of Christianity dissolves and is replaced by another vision of Christianity. So I guess the main watchword here is patience, and continue to contemplate the little seeds of deification that are being sown in these gatherings, and I'm hopeful and confident that it will bear lots of fruit if you open yourselves to it. But it may take repeated seedings for the plant to sprout. Okay, so just a word of encouragement to those of you who've been coming for a little while or been coming for a long while. it's not surprising even in current Wednesday gatherings where somebody will say, boy, that's a real insight. And I say to myself, I think we said that 3 years ago, but sometimes it takes, what do they say? It takes hearing the same thing 7 or 8 times before the reality of it. So it takes a while. Took me, to be able to express what you receive from me every week, it took me at least 32 years of contemplative meditation and investigation and pondering and readjusting and asking for God's grace to understand, to even have a kind of a coherent pitch that I can give to you, that simply because it's so inspiring to me. So I have nothing to really give of my own except to my own way of expressing what I understand the most venerable and ancient tradition of our faith to be. So all of that being said, just keep coming back, and it's such a joy to see everybody every week. Now, what I find myself as we approach the Wednesday gatherings, I never prepare for the Wednesday gatherings except by always doing what I always do, just keep my routine of prayer and try to stay open to the Holy Spirit. But I found in the last couple of months or so that as we come closer to the Wednesday session, I usually think of something on the previous weekend when we have the Mass and I've prepared a homily, something that seems to be helpful to be able to bring from last Sunday's gospel into our Wednesday gathering. I'm not going to try to formalize that into any kind of methodology, but it sometimes serves its purpose. And I thought today, failing somebody else raising their hand and saying, I really have a burning issue, or there was something that was said last week that I really want to explore more. If there is that, please unmute yourself and let me know. Or for those in the room here, what do we have, 11 or 12? 10, okay. And so I'll take whatever comments you may have and try to fold them into what I'd like to lead us with today, reflecting a little bit on last week's gospel, the Transfiguration, and then say how, because ultimately everything in the Christian faith and in this vision of the Christian faith that I'm trying to promote, it all sticks together. So you can literally begin almost anywhere, and it always comes back to the same mystery because it always flows from and returns to the Trinity. Okay, so it's very simple at one level, but there are a lot of different moving pieces that this Trinitarian vision of deification and contemplative prayer can shed light on. It can help us understand any dimension of our Christian faith, but it's all connected to the central mystery of the Trinity. So we, not unsurprisingly, we have a question in the room from our dear friend Gretchen, who's often my catalyst for getting going in the morning. So I need to hear we'll listen to what Gretchen says, and then I want to comment on Cheryl's background in her Zoom call.
I know we've talked about this before. This is in the prayer. So that I can become God is not clear to me.
Okay.
The sentence, so that I can become God.
Okay. So Gretchen's drawing our attention to a line in the prayer that people have found problematic when they first heard it, including myself. When I first heard it in 1994, God became man so man could become God. So everything I say to you in these Wednesday gatherings, and everything I say in my homilies and in anything else I do, always comes back to this, what the early church fathers called the admirable exchange or the wondrous exchange. And what is the exchange? God exchanges or trades. Or as Saint Ephraim the Syrian said, because I have to quote the fathers who said this so clearly, Ephraim the Syrian said, we gave Christ humanity, and Christ gave humanity divinity. Or as Maximus the Confessor says, in the same measure that God became man, human beings become divine. Now, I've explained this at great length prior, but I will explain it again, because the transfiguration and what I want to share with us today is directly connected to this exchange. They call it sometimes the idiomata commercium, the communication of idioms. We gave to God the idiom of being human, and he gave to us the idiomatic expression of being divine. It's an exchange of the way of being. So we gave God the way of being human in Jesus, and Jesus gave us the way of being God in Mary. So there's an exchange that goes on. We clothe him with our humanity, and he clothes us with his divinity, to use images and analogies that the early church fathers said. So you can look at it as an exchange, or you can look at it as a mutual clothing. We clothe him with humanity, so he gets a body and all the human emotions and the human mindset, and he assumes everything that it is to be human. And in exchange, he gives us everything that it means to be divine. So he implants within us the capacity to think like God thinks, to act like God acts, to be as God is. Even though God is still separate from ourselves, he gives us a share in his own divine life, such that if we're doing it properly, if we're opening to it completely, we are acting like God in human form. So we are other Christs, or we are literally an extension of the original Christ. Okay. So we're going to talk lots more about that. And that is the central mystery of the Christian faith. And when you say the purpose of God becoming man is for the purpose of bringing all human beings up into the life of God, such that they become so one with God that when you see another human being, you're actually looking at them and God in them at the same time. They are in God and God is in them, but they are not God and God is not them. But they are inseparable. They are no longer distinguishable. That's the central mystery of Christianity. The central mystery of Christianity is human beings becoming so one with God that even the phrase God-like is not sufficient to describe the glory with which human beings, and the goodness with which, and the beauty with which, and the love with which, and the spirit with which human beings are not just clothed, but penetrated. The image that I've used, I haven't found it yet in any early church father, though it may well be there. If you want to think about the miracle of deification, or becoming gods in God, or becoming God, God became man so I could become God. What does it mean for me to become God? Well, it's like a piece of cloth. If you think of yourself as a piece of cloth, there are many images that saints have used for this over the centuries. I'll use two from John of the Cross and one from Father Phil Krill. And the one from Father Phil is that deification, being brought up into God and being absorbed in God, and having God absorbed into me without me becoming God as God is God. I become God as I am capable of becoming God in God. Okay, that's the best way to say it. And then if you want an analogy for this, just to make it a little more practical, think of a piece of cloth that is being dyed by the color purple. Okay, you take the piece of cloth, and for this purpose of this analogy, God, since purple represents royalty and richness and the epitome of beauty, think of a pool of purple dye as the ocean of God's mercy, okay, or as the very mysterious being of God, this ocean of purple royalty. And you take this little human cloth, like a Lindsay or a Phil or a Jesse, and actually, for the sake of this analogy, let's say that the cloth is heavily soiled by our so-called sins. Okay. Well, let's start with a cloth that's not soiled, and you dip it in and you pull it out, and now a moment ago it was pure white, and now what? It's completely purple, And yet you're dealing with the same white cloth, but now it has the appearance of purple. And it's not only superficially colored with purple, but the purple has penetrated the object in such a way as to become one with it. And even though it's still, the dye in theory is still distinct from the fibers of the cloth, the fibers of the cloth can no longer, at least to perceptible form, the fibers of the cloth can no longer be distinguished from the dye. The fibers and the dye are one. The cloth is now purple, even though it was not originally purple. That's just an image for the mystery of deification, or you know how they used to put little kids' shoes in bronze and they would come out bronzed, okay? That's what's kind of happening. When Christ comes, man, you dip your, that's why we have baptism. You dip the person into the font and they come out golden, except they're not bronze, they're deified, okay? They're not purple, but they are purple. They are empurpled with the royalty of God. Now let's take the heavily, for the sake of today's discussion in particular, let's take the case of the terribly soiled cloth, okay? In the mystery of deification, when you dip this heavily soiled cloth in, the dye, this mysterious dye, also immediately dissolves all the grime. Not only does this dye empurple it, but it's got a mysterious element called OxyClean in it. And OxyClean is the mercy of God, or the fire of God's mercy. Okay, so you know, at the end of the book of Revelations, the lake of fire, the lake of fire is equivalent to what I'm describing to you here as the vat of dye purple, except when you put a cloth in it that has a lot of sins on it, you put it in and there's a kind of initially, before the dye can penetrate the original white cloth, the OxyClean in it, which has kind of an acidic base to it, it first dissolves the grime that's on the cloth. And as far as the grime is concerned, the grime feels like this is an acid bath I'm receiving here. If you're the cloth at that point, you feel like, oh my God, I've been dipped into a vat of hydrochloric acid. Well, no, that's not true. What's happening is the very purple dye that's going to divinize you is first dissolving all of those marks upon your original perfection that need to be dissolved before the dye can actually do its thing. But every cloth goes into the vat. And every cloth eventually comes out beautifully purple, or comes out, actually what happens is every cloth comes out with a color that you can't imagine, because every person that was ever created is created to exhibit a different dimension of the spectrum of God's glory. So there are many more colors in heaven than we're familiar with, because the colors are the beauties within God and the dimensions of God's glory, which each of us is. We are created to be the praise of his glory, Paul says. So that means if you think of a white light coming down into a prism and it's refracted into all these different colors, well, think of human nature being that way. God's light comes down into the whole of humanity and it refracts into as many colors as there are people. Many of those colors are not known to us because our sins obscure them. And when you're dipped into the lake of fire at the end, all of the grime that is obscuring your particular dimension of God's glory is dissolved through a painful process, which feels like fire. That's what we call hell or purgatory. That's the purification process. And I do want to talk about this a little bit today, because we're going to talk about that all shall be saved today a little bit. And what I want to say is that, you know, as I've said before on this gathering, do we have anybody new here? No, we don't, not yet. So I've said before on this gathering, the majority opinion in the early church, especially with St. Gregory of Nyssa and the other Trinitarian theologians of the early church, they all believed that in the end, God would be all in all, and that all things would be reconciled with Christ, as Paul says in many, many different places in his writings. and that in the end, the entire cosmos would be united with God, and everything in creation would be alive with the glory of God. And it would be like the burning bush in the desert. It would be on fire with God's love, but not only would it not be destroyed, it would be glowing with the very life of God. And everything that was ever created will be part of that majestic theophany of God's glory, that manifestation of God's glory. And everything that is created is meant to be a part of that final, what they called the apokatastasis, the final restoration of all things in Christ, the final blooming of all things in Christ, okay? Just two other images from John of the Cross, in addition to my image about the die. John of the Cross talks about the exact same phenomenon, people becoming indistinguishable from God because they are so one with God, and God has so penetrated their being with his divinity that their humanity, like the white cloth, is now empurpled with God's own divinity. And when the angels and saints look at a person so divinized, they see no difference between that person and the three persons of the Trinity. It's almost as if humanity is a fourth person. The whole of humanity is like a fourth person with the three persons of the Trinity, partaking in the same divine empurpled glory that we see within the persons of the Trinity themselves. And the early church fathers always saw humanity as a single person, all of us being cells in a body of a single man, Adam. Adam is the whole of humanity, from the first human to the last human. All of those humans are cells, particular molecules in the entire body of humanity. And that body of humanity is the human form of the Christ. So Christ and that human body are the same mystery. So we are created in Christ, through Christ, and for Christ, and by Christ. So we are, in a certain sense, an extension of Christ. We are the humans. I don't know what the right word is. We are the human manifestation of the eternal Word. Okay. Now, two other images that John of the Cross uses to talk about the individual person who is so permeated and so divinized by the divinity of God through their openness to the Spirit of God. He uses the image of a log in the fire, and he also talks about purgatory and hell in these terms as purification. What I started to say a second ago was, not only did most of the early church fathers believe that all people in the end would be saved as though through fire, but they also believed that the fire that they would experience is not a punitive fire, it's a purifying fire. It's a fire for the chastening of humanity. So it's always a remedial fire, it's always a purifying fire, it's always an annealing fire, it's a tempering fire, it's eliminating the impurities that have been added or overlaid upon the perfect image and likeness of God that each of us is created to be. Okay. And the early church fathers also agreed that depending on how thick that coating of ignorance is, depending on how thick that coating of indifference and what we would call sin is, depending on how thick that is, the process of purification and the experience of purification will be more or less intense or more or less excessive. I always use it. The example I always like is a woman trying to take off her makeup at night, not necessarily, or a chair. I think of a chair because I did this one time when I was trying to find myself. After I left the priesthood, I was stripping and renewing furniture with a friend, and we would get this furniture that was lacquered over with white paint and black paint and red paint, and then he gave me this solvent. You would put the solvent on, it would start to bubble. And I was thinking to myself, if I'm the chair, I'm in agony because all that crap had to be literally scraped off and boiled off. So images of hell and purgatory, the tormenting fire, that is a description of, and actually, though you do it to a chair with acid, God does it to a chair to us with love. Okay. Divine mercy, when it interacts with human rage, causes the rage to start to bubble at the seams. The rage explodes. It's the mercy of God that actually activates the process. It's a catalyst of the process, and the process. I mean, and this is the image of the demons going out of somebody in the Bible. When God touches a person, the love excites, it causes all the grime to flee. But there's wailing and gnashing of teeth by the grime when the grime is fleeing, okay? There's always a combustible process there that has a lot of chaos and smoke connected to it, and fanfare and kerfuffle. But in the end, everything dies down and you just wipe away the ashes, and there's the beautiful, beautiful object restored to its original brilliance. And in our case, restored to even a greater brilliance than it was originally created with. That's the real majestic image of the Christian faith. God is in the process of restoring us to our original beauty. And in the process, he is adding his own beauty to our original beauty. So he's making us more than a perfectly beautiful white cloth, linen cloth. He's making us a beautiful purple cloth, or a beautiful cloth that is our own color, but which comes from his own divinity, which is uncreated light. Okay. Now, two images that John of the Cross uses for this process. The one that kind of includes the purgatorial or the remedial fire aspect. He says, think of a log. There's a blazing fire in your living room, and you go out and you get a log, and the log is like the person, the human person who wants to enter the fire of divine mercy. Okay, because the Holy Spirit is fire, right? It came down like fire on the tongue. And when we say it, when we're in love with somebody, we say our heart is on fire. He's on fire with that. I said to the people last week, that St. John Chrysostom, they asked him, because he was called, Chrysostom means golden mouthed or golden tongued one. John, the preacher, who was the golden tongued, and they asked the golden tongued, what's the key to great preaching? And he says, there's only one key. And they said, is it writing down your homilies? He said, no. He says, is it researching the Bible? He says, no. They said, well, what is it? And he says, well, the only thing the preacher has to do is be on fire with God, with God's love, and everybody can just watch him burn. So fire in its spiritual sense means the fire of love. And that fire burns within us, but it's a good burning. It's not painful, it's sweet. Okay, so John the Cross says, there you have the sweet fire of God's love, and you take a human being who's like a wet log from the forest, and you throw this wet log, we talk about being wet behind the ears, right? Or she's still green. And that's what he says. He says, you take a green log that's wet, throw it into the fire. He says, what do you get? Smoke. He says, you hear hissing, crackling, popping. He says, it's as if the log is in agony. And metaphorically, the log is in agony. He says, and this is where he describes the stages. John of the Cross writes 4 beautiful books, the Ascent to Mount Carmel, the Dark Night of the Soul, the Spiritual Canticle, and the Living Flame of Love. And basically, it's a description of the soul's journey towards God. And it starts out as a wet green log that gets thrown into the fire of divine mercy. And the first stages, the Ascent to Mount Carmel, he has many images that John uses for union with God, but the Ascent to Mount Carmel, if you've ever seen Mount Carmel, it's like walking up Masada. There's switchbacks. It's going to be a painful process, but it's worth the effort. And so John uses many metaphors to describe, but he says with the log, there's an initial stage, which he calls the stage of purgation. So you're being purified, purgated. That's where we get our word purgatory. The early church fathers, whenever you see the reference to hell in the Bible, though there are no references to hell in the Bible. Did you know that? In the New Testament, the word hell never appears. Hades appears in the Old Testament, which is an abode of the dead, which has nothing to do with fire. And then the other one in the New Testament is the Valley of Gehinnom, which is a rubbish dump just outside of Jerusalem. You can see it from the Mount of Olives, where there was always smoldering garbage, and it was just a garbage heap that was always on fire. There were always worms there. The worms never died and the fire never went out. And Jesus uses that as an image of the soul that is in a state of disrepair. And the fire he's talking about is the fire that's going to purify a person who's in that state. Okay, so he refers to that fire as basically the fires of hell, as we understand them, when Jesus spoke about them, refer to the garbage that we put into our own lives when we do things that are not in accord with our original nature. So they're basically the harmful consequences of our own decisions. And Christ comes into the world to save us from the garbage heap. Okay, not to add more fire on it, or if to add more fire on it, to take us out of the garbage heap and to purify us with whatever fire is necessary to burn away the stink and to burn away the gunk. Okay. Well, John the Cross says, as you watch the log undergo a transformation within this fire, you notice there comes a time when the smoke stops. And now you have the log and you can see it burning. But there's another stage to come after this. So now the log has kind of quieted down and the log is offering no more resistance to the fire, but it is not yet perfectly permeated by the fire. The fire is still licking around on top of the log, and the log is still retaining it kind of its own identity within the fire, as it's retaining its identity as the thing that was brought out of the forest. But John says, then if the log is in there long enough and the fire is stoked long enough, there comes a point where the log and the fire become one. And he describes that as the state of incandescence. You know the word incandescent? So that means that the fire has actually penetrated the log. So the fire now is inside the log as well as on top of the log, though the log is still there. The log is still discernible within the fire, but there's no sharp distinction. And the log is glowing with the fire. The fire is in the log and the log is in the fire, and yet the log still has its own nature and the fire still has its own nature, but you couldn't pick up the log without also picking up the fire. And you could no longer pick up the fire without picking up the log. So John says that's what a soul looks like when it's been thoroughly divinized by union with Christ. The other image he uses is a very clear window where the sun shines through it. And he says on a perfectly clear window and the sun shining through, you don't even know the window is there, but the window still is there. And John says that's what a person is like when they are divinized, or when they've been Christified or Godified. When they've been Godified, you can't. I mean, if you ran forward towards the light, you'd run into the window. But the window and the light are so one that the window virtually disappears within the light, and all you see is light. And John says that's what a saint looks like. That's what a divinized person looks like. Okay.
When we receive communion, are we divinized?
So the question from Gretchen is, when we receive communion, are we divinized? And the answer to that is yes, but the effects of divinization are still obscured by any movements of darkness within our own soul. And by movements of darkness, I mean basically what the church would describe as sinful thoughts or behaviors or intentions. Sin means to be out of kilter. That's what sin means. So when I'm turned away from the sun cannot penetrate me. If I'm turned away from the sun, it cannot penetrate me in the way that it could if I were turned face on to it. I'm using an analogy here for the meaning of sin. It's only when I'm perfectly aligned with God and I'm bereft. John the Cross said the window first has to be purified with soap and water from the smudges that are on it if the light is to penetrate it completely. The light is still there and the light is still shining through it to the extent that the window allows it to be shown through it. Okay, now, unlike windows, we have a certain element of choice in all of this. Okay, so we choose to hold on, as John gospel says they preferred darkness to the light because their deeds were evil. So there is a lot of darkness in every person, and there's a lot of blotches and cosmetics that we put on the log and on the window that block, and on ourselves. And the ego is that prophylactic protective layer of defensiveness. And I always condense all sin to the 4 P's, the 4 R's, or the 4 C's. And I'll run through them again real quickly. The 4 P's, which you see revealed in the temptations of Christ by the devil: pleasure, power, prestige, and position. Those are the 4 P's. When I'm wanting position, when I'm wanting prestige, when I'm wanting power, when I'm wanting pleasure, I'm turned away from God. And that the slightest movement of those in my heart puts a block between me, puts a block between the original image and likeness of God, who I am, which also contains my true happiness. And it puts a block. It puts a blind. It pulls down a blind. It brings down a veil. When the veil was torn in two, that's Christ tearing apart any obstacles to our deification. So the 4 P's, the 4 C's: comparison, complaining, criticism, and condemnation. I compare myself to another. How come I'm not as tall as her? How come I'm not as rich as them? How come I'm not as smart as they? Comparison leads to complaining. Oh boy, why did God create me this way? I criticize. I'll never believe in him again. And then I condemn. The hell with that. Okay. So it always follows the same cycle. Or the 4 R's: rivalry, which is like comparison. Rivalry develops quickly into resentment, which turns into rage, which then turns into a desire to have retribution or to retaliate. And then you could add a 5th R: repeat the cycle. Okay, so everybody, and so what original sin means, that all of us in one way or another and to one degree or another have participated in the 4 P's and do so continuously. And in fact, the whole way of the world is to teach you to acquire all of those things. And that's known as the logos, or the logic of the world. And that's why we say the world is in the grip of the evil one, because the evil one is the divider, compare, rivalry, trying to get above everybody with prestige and power. The accuser: I criticize, I condemn, I resent, I retaliate. The accuser. And then finally, the deceiver, to lie about it and say it's good. Everybody does it. What's your problem? So the world is in the grip of the accuser, the deceiver, and the divider. And Christ comes into the world to give us a different operating system. Everybody, before they know better, operates with the mindset, or in terms of computers, I think of it as an operating system. Everybody operates with the operating system of the evil one. Everyone in this world is like the guy who fell off the Empire State Building, and at the 50th floor, somebody heard him say, "So far, so good." It's when we think we're doing the greatest in worldly terms that we're generally the furthest from God. And it's usually not until that quick stop at the bottom that anybody's attention is gotten, that the way that I'm moving is not in the direction of God. And there's so much more I could say about that. Okay. So Christ comes into the world to replace, like he did with St. Paul on the road to Damascus, literally take out the hard drive of our operating system, the whole way we think, the way we feel, the way we look at people, the way we feel, our very emotions. He's coming to replace our human emotions with his divine emotions. Because our human emotions are actually wired in the exact same way as his divine emotions. But our circuitry is changed the moment we're born and look into the eyes of our mothers. We're switched to another channel. And everything runs then according to the logos of the world at that point. But our original wiring is oriented towards God and can operate on God's operating system if we know how to turn off the switch of ours and turn on the switch of his. And that usually has to take place by having a complete breakdown. Your hard drive has to kind of, what do they call it? When a crash. Your hard drive has to crash. If you look at the conversion of most saints, including Mother Teresa, she had the satanic hard drive even when she was a nun. Most priests, most religion doesn't. This is irrespective of what you're doing exteriorly. Everybody operates on the satanic hard drive until it crashes. For some people, by the grace of God, it crashes earlier rather than later, and they awaken. And then they ask for a new operating system, or God simply gives them a new operating system. But for most people, it takes a long time before the old engine dies and you have to replace it with the new engine. The crash can be alcoholism, drug addiction. The crash can be 10 marriages. The crash can be the death of a child. The crash can be anything. I have to give up on the way I'm thinking in order to adopt a new way of thinking. It's only when the pain of holding on becomes greater than the pain of letting go that I'll let go of my previous way of being. And most people, even when they let go, will want to take it back because they're like the Israelites who let go of their operating system in Egypt as slaves, and they moved into the land of freedom, and they got there and they didn't know what to do with it. Just like the Russians, when they got rid of communism, didn't know what to do with it. Now they're going back to it because it's the only thing that, it's like an abusive spouse who gets away, says, this is crazy, kind of has a moment of sanity, says, I'm going to get away from this. I need to put some space between me and this craziness. They get out into that space and they're lost in space and they don't know which way to turn because they have no one to guide them. So they say, oh boy, this is crazy too. I'm going back to the craziness I know than the craziness I don't. So freedom of the spirit is very frightening to people unless God gives a real special grace, as he did to people like St. Augustine, Dorothy Day, John Paul. Everybody that we would call a saint has had a crash and burn experience in their life, but God gave them the new pieces to reconstruct Humpty Dumpty. And they did it. And then they entered into this new life. So nobody can ever say where that point is going to be for somebody else. Okay, so having said all that, let's come to the transfiguration. So that's all background, and that speaks to Gretchen's question. So I said I was going to, somebody said of Cheryl here that she's in such a beautiful spot there. She's in that sunroom. It looks like the Napa Valley is stretching out behind her there. You expect a glass of wine to appear on her computer desk at any moment now. And then Cheryl said, well, it's fake. It's a Zoom background screen that you can insert. You can change you can put yourself in any setting you want. Okay. And I said I would use that as a teachable moment because but I'm going to teach you how to set the backdrop of your life in a way that is not false, but is more beautiful than the one you will see on Cheryl's screen if you were able to see it on Zoom this morning. The transfiguration, which we talked about last week, Christ was transfigured on Mount Tabor, and they saw him. They saw him. It's as if the veil of this world was pulled apart for a moment. And the apostles saw Jesus as he was in the embrace, in the life of the Trinity before he became man in Mary's womb. He was there as the eternal Word, clothed in the uncreated light of God, and he was glowing with that light as a figure within that light. And that light is God, and Jesus is one with that light, and he calls himself the light of the world because he has in himself all the light that is in the Father that is surrounding him. And the Spirit is there as well. And it's a Trinitarian manifestation of the triune God on top of Mount Tabor. And the apostles see that. But what they are seeing there is not only a glimpse of Christ as he was in the Trinity before the world even began, they were also seeing him as he would appear to them when he rose from the dead. And they were seeing him as he will appear at the end of time, also clothed with the Father's glory. Everything, and here's the point that and he revealed that to them because he wants to establish that vision of him as the light of God, and us transfigured by that same light. Remember, Peter, James, and John were there, and they represent just three of the apostles. So, and this kind of represents the challenge of the spiritual life as well. The crowds were left down in the valley. Even the other 9 apostles were left down. What Jesus is saying there is, in order to enter deification, in order to enter the light, in order to enter the life of the resurrection and the life, in order to enter the light of God on the mountain of God, in other words, to enter the dwelling place of God. Remember, the cloud came down on Mount Tabor as well. And you remember in the Old Testament, the cloud came down on the Jewish people, and Moses would go into the cloud and he would come out and his face would be deified. It would be shining with the same light. And so Peter and James and John were enveloped with that light. And the same thing happened to them that happened to Moses. They were clothed momentarily. They were clothed with the glory of God. Their sheets became all purple, to use the analogy that we used earlier. Their windows became translucent with the light of God. Their logs became incandescent with the fire of God. Actually, what they were doing was they were seeing the incandescence of the sun, and it is contagious. The sun, the incandescence of the Trinity wants to pour itself out onto any little person who comes into its presence. But most people, like in the Old Testament, if they were to go into the presence, they would die. They're not capacitated yet to enter the presence and receive the full force of it and be electrified rather than being electrocuted. Okay, so we have to increase our capacity to receive the light of God and the divinity of God. But that's what the whole spiritual life is about. And this little episode on Mount Tabor is to show the world what the Christian life is supposed to be. Ultimately, it's to leave the crowd behind, to leave the world behind, to ascend Mount Carmel or Mount Tabor, to do the arduous work that it takes to escape the gravitational pull of the 4 P's and the 4 R's and the 4 C's and leave that for good. Never look back, just like the Israelites leaving Egypt. Don't go back to the flesh pots of Egypt. Don't go back to slavery. Down there is slavery. You're going to be everyone who sins is a slave to sin. Don't go back to the land of slavery. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And I am the way, the truth, and the life. And I'm up here with my Father. So you have to leave down there and come up here if you want to be one with us. But the moment you come into my presence, I will clothe you with my own divine glory. That's if I had to paraphrase the message of Mount Tabor, that's what it is. And so they are given a glimpse. And so that vision is established in them, Cheryl, and others looking at Cheryl's screen. That vision is established in them. Christ reveals this. He gives this manifestation or this epiphany of his divine glory before, during, and after his life on earth, to establish that as the background in the way that they will operate henceforth. They are to follow him to Calvary and watch him be crucified, but they are always to avert to this beautiful background that they've been exposed. They should never forget that the background of glory is what allows them to endure and to listen to and to go through what is right in front of them. So the Tabor is really establishing the template for the Christian life as a vision of what we are destined for and what we were created for. So that in the moment of our creation is also the moment of our salvation. That's why all people will eventually be saved. Everything that I will be is present in me when I first come to be. Oh, that's beautiful. Everything that I will be is in me when I first come to be. Now, just reflect with me for a second that when did I come to be? I did not come to be when I was conceived in my mother's womb. I came to be as I experience myself now in my mother's womb. But before you were conceived in your mother's womb, Jesus or God says, and through the prophet Jeremiah, before you were conceived in your mother's womb, I knew you. Well, how much longer before I was born did God exist? Forever, to use sequential language. So I must be forever known by God, because for God to know me at all is for God to know me forever. Okay, so who I am and that for which I am destined is known and is me from the moment I was conceived in the mind of God, which is from eternity. Is that making sense to everybody? Let me use a simpler example to share with you, because this is so fundamentally important, and this will allow you to live with the background of the resurrection and the background of the transfiguration in your psyche at all times. You know, there's that ancient Arabic proverb that Nikos Kazantzakis quotes on the flyleaf of his book, The Last Temptation of Christ. It goes like this: I said to the almond tree, speak to me of God, and it blossomed. So when I plant an almond tree seed, right? In that seed are all the almonds that will come from it, correct? In other words, what it's going to be is already present in what it is, but in a different form. So the life of any created object is simply the unfolding of its end. The end of the human person, the goal, the culmination, the consummation, the fulfillment of any human life, of any created object, is already present in an implicit way at its beginning. Our end is in our beginning. Now, everybody's with me on that, right?
But the beginning was forever.
So the acorn, yeah, the beginning not only was the beginning forever, but the end is also the end. So not only is the beginning forever, but the beginning is a participation in the glory of God, because God is nothing other than glory. And everything God creates is glorious as a created participation in the glory of God. And so the seminal idea of every created object is a creative instance of the glory of God, and the full flowering of that created instance of the glory of God is a fuller manifestation of a finite measure of the glory of God. So when we are created by God, we are created perfectly as a created expression of his own infinite goodness and his own infinite glory. And in that conception of us as a finite being in God, but separate from God, the fullness of what he created us to be is also present. I'm stumbling here to express to you what I'm trying to say. We are created in glory, by glory, and for glory. And so the for gloriness that we are created for is in us and always in the process of unfolding in our lived lives here as human beings. St. Paul tries to describe it by saying, those who know themselves in Christ proceed from one degree of glory to another. I mean, just like the oak tree growing. So this is how I can say it. There's a fullness of beauty a fullness of beauty and fruitfulness and goodness and just glory. That's the only word I can. There's a fullness of glory. There's a gloriousness about everything that is created. There's the fullness of the glory with which everything is created.
Can't you use the word potential?
No, you can use the word potential. That's how St. Thomas Aquinas talked about the same thing I'm talking about. But I want to put it in the terms of Trinitarian glory. The glory that is in us is destined to manifest itself in a fullness that is unknown to us when it's still in the process of unfolding. That would be one way of saying it. We are all destined to bloom with a glory that none of us can conceive of. Eye has not seen, ear has not heard what God has in store, meaning in your own blossoming. We have no idea of how glorious we are meant to unfold. That we have no idea of the fullness of glory to which each of us is destined to unfold. That's the way to say it. None of us has any idea of the fullness of glory to which we are destined to unfold. That is already present and in the process of happening, and God will ensure that it happens because it cannot not happen. What God has established in the beginning cannot not come to fruition. Lots of impediments to the total unfolding and coming to fullness of glory of each of us is possible for each of us. We can stymie our growth. We can stunt our growth. It seems like we can even stop our growth. But the end for which God created us, that was implanted in our beginning, cannot stop from being unfolded because it will push through all those things, because the power of God in us is greater than the powers that exist in this world. Does that make sense? Are you following? So I might even try to, let's say this, the full beautiful person that I am and all the things I'm meant to do and you're meant to do and we're meant to do. And each of us has a different gift that is meant to unfold completely as God implanted it in us, primarily for the glory of God. God is glorified in our glorification, because our glorification is implanted in us in our beginning. Our end is in our beginning. That's the main thing I want you to see here. The Transfiguration was like reading a novel and showing you what the end chapter looks like. So that when you go back so now you know what the end chapter looks like. Now when you go back and read all the other shit that's happening during the story, don't be alarmed. These are just little detours that the characters take. It's all going to work out in the end, because I've already given you a vision of what it looks like at the end, in order to help you on your journey and for you to be so fashioned to this vision and so conformed to this vision of my glorification and your glorification in me, that you cease putting any impediments in the way of that process of coming to the fullness of glory in the way. Does that sound good? Yeah,
Yes.
Sounds good to me. Okay.
So everybody's gonna be saved.
So everybody, at least according to your fathers, and I don't want to get too philosophical about this, but I am going to for just a minute. Yes, the answer is that in the end, because our destiny in God to be the fullness of what he created us to be, which is his glorification and our glorification, because he planted the fullness of what we are intended to be in us at the beginning, that our end is in our beginning, then there is nothing, because God desires this, there is nothing that can prevent it from happening. If God is for us, who can be against us? What will separate us from the glory of Christ being manifested in us if that's what God desires? Now, there is a whole argument of people who say, no, I can stop that process by free will. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. I don't want to go quite down that path, but I think I said a couple of weeks ago, or I'll say again here, it's impossible not to believe in God. It's impossible not to believe in God. Now, boy, I gotta think of the right way here without this devolving into the wrong line of thinking for you and get you off the track. Let me start with it. So I want to just say that scandalous statement. It's impossible to not believe in God. There are many people who deny the existence of God. Let's start there. Many people who deny the existence of God. Okay. Now that's ludicrous on its face. I mean, to deny the existence of God doesn't mean there's not a God. But what I want to say to you is the denial of the existence of God is actually the proof of God's existence. That's what I really want to try to show you here this morning. And once you see that, you may also be able to make the connection how it's simply not possible for the end for which we are created not to come to be. If you can understand how it's not possible to not believe in God, if you can understand how it's impossible to not to believe in God, you will also catch a glimpse of how it's not possible for the end for which God created us not to come about. Okay, but that's a big step intellectually and philosophically. So I'll try to make it as simple as I can. So when I say I think it's pretty evident to everybody when I say that somebody who denies the existence of God doesn't mean God doesn't exist. And I'm going a step further, saying it actually proves that God does exist. How does it prove that God exists? Well, we know that I can deny something that doesn't exist and it can still exist. Okay, for years people denied there was such thing as radio waves, but then they found a way of showing that they're actually real. So the whole history of science is the inconceivable becoming manifest. Okay, so you don't want to deny the existence of too many things because there's no way for you to know. But how does the denial of the existence of God prove the existence of God? Like this. When I say there is no God, so let me just take one step back and remind you that Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, right? I am the truth. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So I want to say this, and I mean, this is not the right way to argue this if you were in a classroom, but I'm going to say this. God is the fullness of truth. God is the fullness of beauty. God is the fullness of love. We can get that from the Gospels, and we know that Jesus is God. So when Jesus says God, John says God is love, we mean God is the fullness of love. When Jesus says I am the truth, we mean God is the fullness of truth. When the Song of Songs says my beloved is beautiful, he's saying God is the fullness of beauty. I think everybody would agree with me like that. And even Plato and other philosophers have said the very definition of God is the summa bonum, the highest good, the highest beauty, the highest love, the highest truth is God. So God is the fullness of truth, and anything that is true because it's a participation in God. Okay, would everybody kind of following me with that? So when the atheist says there is no God, he's asserting that as true. In other words, he's saying this is the truth. In other words, he's reaching for the truth, and he believes he's in possession of the truth. And that good feeling that he has when he says, this is the truth, I believe this is the truth. He's believing in the truth, and the truth is God. So that very thing that makes him so happy, I'm sure there is no God, is actually God. God is the truth that he's holding on to, that there is no God. He's just not able to see it for what it is. In other words, I can never utter a statement, even if it's I believe in there is no God. I can never utter a statement that I don't believe is true or I don't believe is good. And when I believe that what I'm saying and what I'm doing is good, I'm actually holding on to God by cherishing that goodness and that truth insofar as I have a hold of it. I might be totally deceived about the good, but I am holding on to that which I'm holding on to because it seems to me good. In other words, I'm attaining to the good and I'm identifying it with this content. The content, I may be deceived about the content, but I'm not deceived about the fact that it feels good to me. In other words, my soul is yearning for that which is good. My soul is yearning for that which is true. My soul is yearning for that which gives me delight, which is beauty. Every soul is yearning for that. Even so, it's impossible not to do the good. It's impossible not to speak the truth. It's impossible not to love the lovely. It's impossible to do it. Even when I deny it, I'm affirming it. When I deny there is no truth, I'm telling you that because it's true. It is absolutely true. There is no truth. And even when a person chooses to do evil, they do it because they believe it's good. I'm killing you for your own good. And even if you claim, well, I did it because I was crazy, you're saying you have to accept this as good because I was crazy. Craziness makes it good. It's impossible to avoid or escape the good. It's impossible to escape or avoid the true. And it's impossible to avoid or escape the lovely, because every time you deny it, you have to assume it. You have to reach for it in your very denial of it. When I say I'm going to tell a lie, I think it's good for me to tell a lie in this situation. Every time I try to justify something to myself, I'm reaching for the good. I'm trading on the good. I'm relying on the good. Okay, let me read how I actually tried to write this stuff out for myself today. So here's what I said. Even when I choose evil, I do so implicitly because I think it will benefit me or others. That's something I choose. Even when I choose evil, I choose it as something good at the moment. Seemed like a good thing to do at the time. Even if I deny I'm doing this because I'm crazy, I also implicitly appeal to the goodness or okayness of being crazy. In other words, being crazy makes it okay. So being crazy must be good to a certain extent, or at least being crazy leaves me off the hook. Every word I utter, every question I ask, every thought I think aspires to be true. I say what I say because I believe it's true. I deny what I deny because I think it's true. I do what I do because I think it's good. Even when I do what I know is bad, I think it's good for me to assert my freedom that way. And that's what's wrong ultimately with the concept of freedom that underlies those who say I can freely choose to keep myself out of heaven. Freedom is not the ability to do whatever I want arbitrarily and without thought of consequences. Freedom is the inability to do anything that is not perfectly good, beautiful, or true. So if you see a little girl put her hand in the fire and she gets burned, now she knows the truth, and the truth will set her free. Freedom means the inability to put the unwillingness to put my hand back in that fire. Freedom does not, so then if the girl says, no, I'm going to prove my freedom by putting my hand back into the fire, even though I know the fire is going to kill me. You wouldn't call that freedom. You would call that insanity. So anybody who's not insane will always be set free by the truth, not by the ability to do anything they want to do, whether or not it's true. And that's why Jesus says, you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. And everyone who sins is a slave to sin. In other words, they know not what they're doing. They're under a form of bondage. So all of that being said, I hope by trying to demonstrate with a few simple examples, not in a very powerful or elegant way, but if you can see that everything I say is aimed at the true or the good, you will see that everyone is oriented towards God, and it's impossible not to be oriented to God. And even if you're crazy, your intrinsic orientation still is to God. People who are crazy, even within their craziness, are doing things that seem good and true to them in their insanity. Okay, so the good and the true is irrespective of emotional state or anything. We are hardwired towards the good, and the good that we seek is not only the good of these partial statements of this is true and that is true. In those statements, we want the whole truth to be known. So our souls are searching to be one with the truth of it all, not just the truth of this little situation. And when I reach for the truth, it's because this background of the full truth is always back there shining on me, trying to move me towards that for which I am destined, which is union with the full truth, union with the fullness of beauty, union with the fullness of goodness. And that's what we call God. Okay, so I hope all of that is helpful. And what I wanted to point out then about the transfiguration was that is a glimpse of our final destiny, which is which we have the opportunity to say yes to. Now that we know what we are going to look like in the end, we need not fear letting go of what we have looked like in the past. As St. Paul says, I look for what is to be, not what has gone before. I look forward, not backwards. That's why the windshield's bigger than the rearview mirror, you know. What will be, and God, because I am destined for the fullness of glory, both with God and as a manifestation of God's own glory. You see, my life is meant to be as fruitful as God desired it to be when he created me in the beginning. That oak that I'm meant to become, or that dogwood that I'm meant to become, or that almond tree that I'm meant to become, or that beautiful cherry blossom tree that I'm meant to become. It was there the moment I became a seed. So and each of us is a seed from Christ. And here now I'm going to use the image of men and women. The seed comes from God the Father. Okay, Christ is the original seed of the Father. He comes as the life of the Father into the womb of the world. The world and humanity is the woman. The humanity as a whole, Adam and Eve, has a kind of feminine dimension about it. Christ is the seed of the Father inseminating the virgin bride who is humanity, and Mary was the actual singular womb in which the seed of God was conceived. But Mary is the womb of the world. Mary is the womb of the whole of humanity. Mary is the second Eve who conceives the seed of the Father, and the glory that is in the seed of the Father, which is manifested there on Mount Tabor in the Transfiguration. That same glory at Tabor is the same glory that we talk about when Christ comes again with all the angels and saints. It's that same glory, but in its human fullness, with all the human beings created with their own little seeds of glory. We are all seeds of glory in the seed of glory. Christ was like a cluster bomb, when he was implanted in the womb of Mary. He was a single seed, but all of us were in that seed. And our flourishing, our fullness, our full flowering, all the things I'm meant to do for God, all the things you're meant to do for God, all the things all the gifts that have been implanted in that seed that you are. Every seed is different. Every human person is it's a treasure trove of fruitfulness and glory. Even children who die, like my sister at 9 months, her seed was a 9-month seed that was meant to blossom quickly and continue to give its aroma to the world until the end of time. Everything that happens is orchestrated by God in a way that is so far beyond our ability to synthesize it that we should let it go completely. All you have to know is that it all turns out just like he looked like on Tabor. It all turns out gloriously. And if I have that vision implanted in the background of my life, when people look at me, they'll say, "Boy, you're in a good place," like they said to Cheryl. "Boy, you're in the lap of luxury." That's right, because I'm living in the light of the resurrection. I'm living in the light of the transfiguration. I'm already living in the light of the fullness of glory that is my destiny. And is your destiny, and in fact is the destiny of the whole cosmos. I'm already living in that reality because my end is in my beginning. And I'm in the process, I'm saying yes to the process of my own glorification and the release within me of everything that God has given, not me, he's implanted it in me for the life of the world. I don't belong to myself. None of us belongs to ourselves. We are seeds of God's glory, whose flowering is meant to beautify the cosmos and to beautify humanity and to glorify God, primarily to glorify God. We are simply meant, how when they send I saw an image of the rover that landed on Mars, and it said when it lands, then it unfolds these solar panels so that it can soak up the energy and power everything up on Mars. Well, we're like that. We're seeds that are meant to unfold to the light of God so he can kind of photosynthesize us with his own life, and then we can give off oxygen, beauty, goodness, everything that we are created to give off. And then when this instrument has done its thing, it will dissolve, but the glory that is inherent in it and the unique persons that we are in it will also be glorified and find our place in what St. Paul called the pleroma, the fullness of God. St. Paul uses phrases like that. We will become the very fullness of God. See, in the end, humanity and the universe and God will be all one thing. When I look at you, I'll see God, even though I'll know God is beyond you. I will see you in God, and I will see God in you, and yet I'll also see you. It'll be you, God in you, and God beyond you. But it's you. It's you as I always thought you were, not as I made you out to be when I was demonizing you. Oh, that's you. That's why people are surprised when they meet people in heaven. Oh, that's you. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. We used to fight across the picket fence. That's you. Yeah. You know the story of people coming up to heaven, and the big long line, and the word gets passed by. He's letting everybody in, and of course, then you have a big group over on the side saying, "I'll be damned if she's going in. I ain't going in. I'll be damned." And then you get about 10,000 people saying all together, "I'll be damned. I'll be damned." But even God comes out there, like at the wedding feast. Even there, he comes out there and says, "Well, come on in. It's not that. I ain't going in there. I'm not going to associate with those people." But over time, you see God's mercy wears down that obstacle, like a little drop of water on a rock. It eventually melts the whole thing, and you get the Grand Canyon. So no amount of human stubbornness can resist the unfolding of God's glory that he made each of us to be. Will it be a painful process? Well, that depends on whether or not we want it to be a painful process. It's going to be a painful process for the whole of creation. Paul says creation is groaning. It's groaning. It's like a mother trying to give birth. There are birth pangs going on here. Everybody in the evil one's still trying to hold on, and the mercy of God's trying to break through. So, because God compels nobody, and he has created us to want to be in a free association with him. He wants us to freely let go of any obstacle that keeps us. He wants us, if we want to return to the land of slavery, he's got all eternity to wait for us. So if you need to go back and try that addiction a little while longer, go ahead and do it. Eventually you're going to get sick of it again. So eventually sin and evil will do themselves in, because they just become so disgusting after a while that even if you commit suicide, you're still reaching for the truth. You just want to be done with this, and you think it's a good idea to be done with this. So when you commit suicide, you meet God anyway. And you realize, I can't find the truth by killing myself. I have to find the truth some other way. So the truth never leaves me. God never leaves me. It's just that I evade the truth. I avoid the truth. So when we stop running, God will still be there saying, that wasn't so bad, was it? In the end, it kind of dies with a whimper. Evil does. But until that time, it throws a hissy fit. So let me stop it there, because we have 10 minutes left, but I want to, is there anybody on the Zoom or in the, well, I guess the room has had their chance. Anybody on the Zoom who wants a comment or a question? That's an awful lot, but what else is new, right?
What about the gospel for next Sunday? The gospel next Sunday, I know, a whole new session.
We'll let that unfold as it will. Right now, I can just see what's behind me. I can't think.
Okay, all right. Should have asked in the beginning. Okay.
Talk about it next week, though.
Yeah,
Alright.
that was Rosemary, you were asking a question. I was thinking along to, as we draw closer to the Passion and, how to really frame things as we move along so that we can observe in view of, the Trinitarian aspect of what we're seeing.
That, Carol, when you rephrase, or Cheryl, when you rephrase it like that, I know exactly what to say. Here's a way for you to think about the upcoming Passion of Christ. The Passion of Christ, then and now. You can even see it in today's gospel, where the mother of the sons of Zebedee asks for a power play with her kids, and then Jesus says, you know how the Gentiles lord it over them, et cetera, et cetera. You all know that. Well, the Passion of Christ, then and now, is that people approach his crucifixion and his death and his agony while forgetting the backdrop of his transfiguration. In other words, the Passion of Christ is that people focus on his physical suffering rather than his spiritual joy at the knowledge that this is all the part of my own glorification and the glorification of the world. Jesus talks about the Son of Man entering his glory. And by his glory, he means his glory on the cross. When he relinquished himself completely in trust to the Father and resisted the last temptation of Christ to curse his oppressors. From the very beginning, the devil tried to get him to curse and choose power, position, and prestige. If you are the Son of Man, come down from that cross. And the last temptation of Christ was the first temptation of Christ. Curse God and be dead. And he relinquished that temptation. And he relinquished, see, he was tempted in every way we are, but never without sin. He never consented to comparison. He never consented to criticism. He never consented to condemnation. I condemn no one. Go in peace. Your faith has saved you. Relinquishing. So the triumph of Christ, the glory of Christ, the reason all the Byzantine crucifixes picture him with a smile on his face. is because he never stepped out of the transfiguration, even when he was undergoing his humiliation. And the clearest manifestation of God's glory in this world is when a person allows themselves to be unjustly assassinated by another and opens not their mouth, but blesses rather than curses. The first responder who goes into the burning building while everybody else is running out, he's in the glory of God. He's going to die. His death is glorious. Death and glory are not the opposites. They're synonymous in a person who realizes resurrection is always a matter of giving away rather than taking back. When I relinquish, I receive. When I covet, I condemn. So it's a great paradox. So the passion of Christ is that those who do not view his life from its end, but rather from its middle.
So is his that like kind of final instruction, stay awake and pray, was that really, because they talk about them falling asleep in their grief, but was that really to focus them on what happened during the transfiguration and to always stay in that vision, be awake in that vision?
They were asleep on the mountain as well. You remember they were overwhelmed by the cloud and they were terrified. And if you look at icons of the transfiguration, all three of them are actually sleeping. And it is a premonition of the garden as well, because they're sleeping in the garden as well. The overwhelmingness of the grief that they're experiencing. I say this at funerals all the time. The grief that caused them to fall asleep, basically falling asleep in the garden was kind of a circuit breaker. It was their way of coping with the enormity of the grief. But grief is always just like denial of God's existence is the affirmation of God's existence. The grief is always the yearning for infinite love, just in its negative form. Grief is a desire for love, but its manifestation is that of pain. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Grief is love denied, but love denied is love desired. And that's why the love that's desired is the infinity of love that no finite object that I continue to cling to is able to give me. So I have to be able to transfer my infinite desire for love from a finite object of my attachment to the infinite that I am searching for in the finite. I'm not exactly answering your question, Cheryl, but the whole thing is the absolute overshadowing the relative and causing it to have a momentary blackout. We'll have more about the passion as we get closer to Holy Week, and I'll be my opportunity again to dismantle the traditional theory of atonement and try to replace it with a more transfigured at-one-ment idea, but let's save that until then. For the moment, let's say the glory be, and then I'll stay on the call for a while. Name of the glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
Father?
Yeah.
So in preparation for Holy Week, what do you recommend for us to do?
Read it backwards. Start with the resurrection and read it backwards.
Resurrection and read it backwards. Okay.
So whose translation do you like the best?
Thank you.
Translation of what?
I mean, which of the gospel accounts do you suggest?
For the Passion, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
I always prefer John to any of the Gospels. But if I had to choose a synoptic gospel, it would be Luke.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thanks, Jesse. Everybody got an article, huh? Okay.
We didn't get an article.
Thank you. What is it?
I don't think he heard you, Rosemary.
Get up early.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you so much. Wish we could be there live.
I do too. Soon.
Soon, okay.
Tell those Carmelites to stop being afraid.
Yeah, fear is painful, but they want love.
Yeah. All right. Have a wonderful week. I'll see you again.
Thank you all.
Yes,
Bye.
everybody, thank you.